All right. Today we're going to cover the article on terrorism. It was an article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, um, and the author is one of the few philosophers working on the issue of terrorism. Um, so yeah, I've got the classic, well, not classic, but the picture we think of when terrorism comes to mind. September 11th. Ironically, I'm actually recording this lecture on September 11th, 2013. So I'm sure my Facebook feed, as everyone else's, is full of people reminiscing about where they were on 9/11 and posting news links and stuff. So, um, and 9/11 is the event that kind of really generated a lot of philosophical interest in terrorism. Now, it was probably the biggest terrorist attack of all time, and that's one reason why. But it's obviously like there's been far more deaths to terrorism outside of the United States than within. Uh, but that's a whole other issue of it took something in the United States to get philosophers interested, or something in Britain, for example. Um, anyways, there's a whole lot of issues related to terrorism that actually there's a whole lot of aspects of terrorism that touches on other aspects of global ethics. Um, we're just going to focus on two issues today. There's a lot more that can be said and a lot more that needs to be studied, but we're just going to focus on two things. But before I look at those two things, terrorism is related to immigration. Terrorism is related to the whole stuff with Edward Snowden right now. I had you do a discussion assignment on Edward Snowden a few weeks ago, and the reason the NSA and the CIA basically beefed up surveillance, that's post 9/11 stuff. It was to prevent stuff like 9/11 from happening. That's the justification the NSA and the CIA and other intelligence agencies gave. So again, something that we've already looked at in the unit on just war theories connects to terrorism. Um, anyways, like I said, we're going to focus on two aspects. So let's just get down to it. Two philosophical questions pertaining to terrorism. Conceptual. What is terrorism? So basically, it's just how do you define terrorism? How do you distinguish terrorism from perhaps other types of, for example, acts of war or acts of violence or political action? So it's a conceptual issue. And now it might seem boring to say how you know coming up with definitions is just boring. Why are we wasting our time doing this? But the conceptual issue is related to the next question, which is the moral issue. Can terrorism ever be morally justified? And there's a sense in which the moral issue or the answer to the moral question is dependent on the answer you give to the conceptual question. Part of it is just how you define it. But it's not only that, and we're going to look at more depth at that shortly. So, we're first going to look at the first question, the conceptual meaning of terrorism, the concept of terrorism. What satisfies that concept? There's a core meaning to this that philosophers generally agree upon. Terrorism is a type of violence that is inflicted not for its own sake, but for the sake of a further aim. Usually a political objective, but not necessarily. It could be, for example, a religious objective. Uh, but it's a type of violence used for the sake of a further aim. That's the core meaning. Um, Now, I personally wonder if this core meaning is too broad of a meaning, and I think it is, and I think the author of the article also thinks that the core meaning is too broad because there might be things that we wouldn't call terrorism that this definition also applies to. But we'll get to that. So, with this core meaning in place, I note an interesting implication, though. And that is actually not with the core meaning being too broad, but actually drawing attention to just how narrow that is. Basically, the Joker, not the Joker from the 1960s Batman, but the Heath Ledger Joker from The Dark Knight, wouldn't be a terrorist on the core meaning. Because the Joker didn't act for the sake of a further aim, like a political objective. The Joker just liked chaos and violence for its own sake. So, the Joker, I guess you read some critics, he's kind of treated like Christopher Nolan, was inspired by a lot of terrorist attacks in how he wrote the character of the Joker in The Dark Knight. But there's a sense in which the Joker wouldn't count as a terrorist because the Joker didn't have any aim other than the violence of itself. He didn't have a further political objective. So what does that make the Joker? I don't know. A monster? Maybe we need another concept for people like the Joker. Hopefully we won't need to come up with one, because hopefully there's just not many people like that out there, and hopefully none that will ever be as influential as his character was in the movie The Dark Knight. Anyways, that's just an aside for all you comic book fans out there. So there are two core traits of terrorism and two types of definitions. The author says, first, two core traits are violence and intimidation. So it's not just violence, but the violence is meant to evoke a reaction in even people that aren't directly impacted by the violence. And that's where the intimidation comes in. So I'll just go back to the example of 9/11 because it's the terrorist attack people think of when we talk about terrorism. There is the violence caused against people in the trade centers and in the airplanes. And then there's the intimidation factor. Oh no, we need to, ideally, the terrorists would want people to kind of be afraid, to give in to the terrorist demands or whatever. That's the intimidation factor. So terrorism is a type of violence that aims at intimidation. Intimidation is one of the aims of terrorism. And another aim is the furtherance of a political, social, or religious goal, or more broadly, coercion. So that's, let's just go on the next slide. So he says from there, there's actually two different types of definitions, what we call a narrow definition and a wide definition. And the author looks at the both narrow and wide definitions of terrorism. He's going to leave aside who the actor is and what the ultimate objectives are. So it doesn't matter if the actor is a Middle Eastern or a European or a United States citizen or an Asian. And it also doesn't matter if it's a political objective or a religious objective. And so those are all obviously important, but we're going to focus on instead what kind of thing is done and what the proximate aim of doing it is. So narrow definitions then will define terrorism as violence against non-combatants or innocents, whereas wide definitions don't have that restriction. Basically, they don't only restrict the violence to non-combatants. So we'll take a look first at the narrow definitions. These capture the morally salient difference between, for example, planting a bomb in a government building and killing officials of, say, an unjust and oppressive government, versus planting a bomb in a tea shop and killing common citizens, including small children. So the former type of act against the government would not be considered terrorism on the narrow definition, whereas the latter act against the people in the tea shop would count as an act of terrorism on the narrow definition. This narrow definition rules out what, I don't think it's an ill-thought cliche, but I do think most people that use this cliche haven't thought it through, so I guess I should clarify what I mean by ill thoughts. But you often hear people say, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And they're generally saying it trying to be really profound. And, they think they have refuted the other person. Well, on the narrow definition, this narrow definition rules out that cliche, because the narrow definition is such that its application isn't just observer dependent. So on this narrow definition, killing where you're killing non-combatants or innocents, like children, for example, whether or not a person is a terrorist or a freedom fighter isn't a matter of perspective, because either you're a combatant or you're not. So this narrow definition, so basically the ill-thought cliche is false if the narrow definition of terrorism is true. Because we actually have pretty precise ways of applying that concept and knowing when something satisfies or doesn't satisfy that concept. And I count that as an asset of the concept, mainly because I consider that an asset of any concept. If the conditions of application of the concept are really clear, that's an asset of that concept. So, which is not related to the moral issue. That's another issue. I'm just saying in terms of the defining things. So the narrow definitions also focus on the traits of terrorism and that, cause most of us to view the practice as morally horrendous, mainly violence against non-combatants or innocents, for the sake of intimidation and sometimes coercion. So it's always, of course, tragic when large numbers of soldiers die, but there's a sense in which when they become a soldier, they kind of know that they're going to be putting their lives at risk in these situations, and it's an expectation. Whereas non-combatants, innocents like children and the elderly, though, we tend to be horrified. Well, one, it could be us, or it could be someone we know. Two, it's no longer clear where it's safe and where it's not. And three, recall just war theories that we looked at, like Elizabeth Anscombe's argument in War and Murder, for example, who argues vehemently against killing innocents, intentionally, that is, killing innocents. So, yeah, basically with respect to non-combatants and innocents, most just war theories forbid intentionally killing them. And so this narrow definition kind of aligns itself nicely with just war theories. In fact, you could say perhaps it's the definition that just war theories would assume. All right, well, let's take a look at wide definitions. Wide definitions don't just restrict acts of terrorism to non-combatants or innocents. There could also be acts of terrorism against soldiers, against combatants, against non-innocents. One advantage of this definition, so I didn't cover this, but in the article, the author has gone through the history of the usage of the term terrorism and what kinds of acts and persons it was applied to. Good historian, he knows a philosopher, he did some good historical work on that. This wider definition is kind of more consonant with that and how it's been used throughout history. Further, the wide definition has the advantage of avoiding the charge of begging the question by defining terrorism in such a manner that makes it unjustified by definition. So remember, on the narrow definition, it's defined in part as violence against non-combatants. And on just war theories, that's wrong. By definition, that's wrong. If you intentionally kill non-combatants, it's wrong. Okay? According to some philosophers, that's a big sin. It's begging the question. Or just the moral status of terrorism is implied in the definition. Whereas if you want the moral status of terrorism to be neutral, then the wide definition is the route to go. Of course, the author is doubtful that terrorism could ever be defined in a morally neutral way. Some terms just aren't morally neutral. For example, rape or murder. The moral status of the deed is implied by the very definition of it. There's no such thing as justified rape or justified murder. We do distinguish between justified homicide, which is killing, but murder just is always wrong. It's just implied in the definition. So the point is, what's wrong with that? Why can't the moral status of an action be included in the definition of the action? The wide definition is consistent with the cliche, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Because the application of the definition, it's less easy to agree on, basically. It's less obvious when it applies and when it doesn't. So there may be an observer-dependent aspect of it. So, okay, this leads to the moral issue. We've been looking at the conceptual issue. Now here's the moral question. Can terrorism ever be morally justified? Now, on the narrow definition, and especially if you're a just war theorist, the answer is always going to be no. But just what if you're a consequentialist, for example? And not so just war theory isn't strictly consequentialist or non-consequentialist. It's more complex than that, or you could say it's more rich than that. You can't put it in that box. You can put it in another box. You just couldn't put it in that box. But that's not the only theory in town. So that's why this question is, actually a relevant thing. Can you ever justify terrorism? Now, the author has, and I think the author has an answer in mind to this question, but it's worth seeing how he gets there. So, important. I've already said this, but it's worth stressing again. The answer to this question will actually depend on the definition of terrorism you assume. Okay? So, in addition to depending on what type of theory of just war you assume, it also will depend on the definition of terrorism you assume. All right? Keep that in mind. So, are you going with the wide or the narrow definition? Well, the focus of the article will be terrorism is understood as violence against innocent civilians or common citizens, intended to intimidate and achieve some usually political objective. So, looks like he's focusing on the narrow, on the narrow definition. So, all right. So, what the author does then is he looks at arguments in which terrorism can be morally justified, and then he assesses the arguments. So he looks at several, and we're going to look at a few. And I call them bad arguments, because the author's response to them is pretty fatal, I think. So first argument. This is written by I'm not sure who wrote it. Well, let's just read the quote. The good bourgeois, who hold no office, but who reap their dividends and live idly on the profits of the workers' toil, they also must take their share in the reprisals. And not only they, but all those who are satisfied with the existing order, who applaud the acts of the government, and so become its accomplices. In other words, the daily clientele of Terminus and other great cafes. So this is not written about the United States right now. It's written about in another time and place and about another group of people, but it'd be like saying the 1%, for those of you familiar with the Occupy movement, the 1%, the wealthiest people who are making their money while the poor get poorer and so on, deserve it. That is a case of justified terrorism, basically. Yeah, bomb their country clubs. Bomb their luxurious Manhattan apartments, all right? Because they're making money off of, and just keeping the people down and oppressing them, perhaps resulting in deaths throughout the world, and so on. Okay, so that's an argument. Well, the author finds some flaws with that argument, though. One, this implausibly claims that all members of a social class, including infants, are to be killed for either operating or supporting or benefiting from an unjust system. I'm not saying our system's unjust. I'm just saying, according to the Occupy movement, our system's unjust. So, and of course, the quote's not about Occupy, but it's just to put some, use a contemporary example. Two, not every degree of involvement in an unjust system merits the same response, violence, that is. Even if benefiting from the system is blameworthy, it isn't always worthy of death in the way that we say operating the system is. So you can be a participant and gain many benefits and goods from a just and oppressive system without you specifically deserving death. So basically, not everyone is equally guilty and deserving the same punishment, and that seems to make sense. People have different levels of responsibility and blame involved in it, and their punishment basically should be proportional to their crime. Whereas that bad argument one seems to argue for a punishment that is disproportionate to many persons' involvements. Okay. Bad argument two from Osama bin Laden. And I can't believe I'm actually doing this. I'm teaching a philosophy class, and I'm assessing an argument that Osama bin Laden gives. I've never ever thought I'd be doing that. That just shows you how unique global ethics is as a class. I cannot believe I'm doing this, but here we go. So bin Laden writes, and I quote, "The American people should remember that they pay taxes to their government and that they voted for their president. Their government makes weapons and provides them to Israel, which they use to kill Palestinian Muslims. Given that the American Congress is a committee that represents the people, the fact that it agrees with the actions of the American government proves that America in its entirety is responsible for the atrocities that it is committing against Muslims." So there's bin Laden's argument. Well, there's a flaw with this argument. Pretty gaping flaw. Not every degree of involvement with the American political system, assuming for the sake, and only for the sake of argument, that Osama bin Laden is right, merits the same type of response, violence. Again, he wants an equal punishment when everyone's got differing degrees of responsibility, assuming he's right. Okay, so that's a pretty gaping flaw. So we've seen two arguments for when terrorism can be justified, and they seem to fail pretty badly. Pretty badly. All right. Well, maybe we could find a consequentialist justification for terrorism. So remember, consequentialists will judge terrorism, like every other practice, solely by its consequences. So consequentialists aren't like just war theorists the way Elizabeth Anscombe was a just war theorist. And the moral status of terrorism doesn't necessarily imply that the bad consequences outweigh the good. So maybe consequentialism is open to it. So for example, Kai Nielsen, working with a wide definition of terrorism, argues that sometimes, in fact, terrorism can be justified. He writes, and I quote, "Terrorist acts must be justified by their political effects and their moral consequences. They are justified, one, when they are politically effective, weapons in the revolutionary struggle, and 2, when everything considered, there are sound reasons for believing that by the use of that type of violence, rather than no violence at all, or violence of some other type, there will be less injustice, suffering, and degradation in the world than would otherwise have been the case. So basically, sometimes terrorism can have overall good consequences, according to Nielsen. Well, there's a response. Mainly, that's inconsistent with historical experience. On the contrary, terrorism, even on a small scale used to provoke the masses into action, is usually, well, quite frankly, it's ineffective and counterproductive. On the flip side, not only did the consequentialist argument for the occasional justification of terrorism have flaws with it, there's actually consequentialist reasons to hold that terrorism could actually never be justified. Mainly, terrorists are not at all likely to perform the consequentialist calculations necessary to see if a particular act is justified. And he lists a lot of other reasons in this section as well, but that's just, that's one striking reason. Okay. Well, in a non-consequentialist framework, terrorism would probably just be considered wrong in itself, definitionally, just because of what it is, rather than only because of its consequences are bad. You're probably not going to find a non-consequentialist justification for terrorism. And that is all. That was, that was the lecture.